All right, thanks to everyone for being here. I just want to be mindful of people's time, so we'll get started. Welcome to the March Sustainability Series. We're excited this month to be hosting Matt Spiten of Mayo Clinic, a respiratory therapist, to talk about a project that's been going on in the community for a number of years, affectionately called the Rochester Air Champions. As usual, what we'll ask of participants is to just type questions in the chat as Matt's working his way through the presentation, and then we'll also have a lot of time at the end for questions as well. But mostly, I just want to welcome and thank Matt for being here for this month, and excited to learn more about this exciting community project. So take it away, Matt.
All right, thanks, Kevin, for the introduction. Just gonna pull up and share my PowerPoint here. Give me just a moment. Okay, yeah, so thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm very excited to talk about this project, and yeah, we've been working on it for going on 4 years now. So we've done a lot in the community, and just excited to share our progress. So the title of the presentation is Rochester Air Champions, Advancing Environmental Health Through Citizen Science. And my name is Matt Spiten. I'm a respiratory therapist at Mayo Clinic. So just to start, I just wanted to give kind of an introduction of the project and how it came to be. So I first became fascinated with air quality at UMR when I was studying respiratory care. And it was really my passion for respiratory health and the environment that led me to found the Sierra Student Coalition when I was there. And my goal at the time was to provide pathways for students to explore the connection between the environment and specifically the air we breathe and our health. And I wanted to do this through a scientific lens, being at the University of Minnesota Rochester and being right next to Mayo Clinic in the City of Health. So as I started to volunteer my time with the local Sierra Club, I was able to get connected with some of what I consider world-class doctors, scientists, and then just community leaders who also shared my passion for the environment and health. And this led to the formation of an ad hoc group originally, which was looking to utilize a citizen science framework to better understand the complexities of air pollution and its relation to our health. And after kind of a brief multidisciplinary feasibility study that was focused on studying the geospatial variation of particulate matter, specifically PM2.5 in Rochester, the Rochester Air Champions was formed. And it was through this original work that the feasibility study was able to expand, grow, evolve, and eventually become part of a greater mission to transform Rochester to that city of health. So this presentation is really the story of that journey from just a small student group to a more broad community-based research project. So I want to start by just giving a little bit of a background of the project, why we needed this project and how we went about it. So air pollution. There are two main types of air pollution, typically particulate and gas. The Rochester Air Champions chose to focus on the particulate matter 2.5. And we specifically wanted to know, or this is actually the 2.5 is in reference to the diameter of the particle. And this is where my career as a respiratory therapist became so important, as particles at this size are so small that we can breathe them into our lungs. And over time and even acutely, people who may have chronic respiratory conditions can be impacted significantly by this exposure. And there are a number of primary sources of particulate pollution, the main one really being vehicle emission. And this is often why we see traffic volume as a surrogate marker when we're predicting health outcomes or predicting air pollution, the geospatial variation in communities. Another way is through the burning of combustible material. And I'm really thinking of like wood right now. And when we burn these things, particulates release into the air. And this is a good example as for why we see air quality alerts when we see forest fires in Canada. And then lastly, industry. So the burning of fossil fuels, that's going to have some effects that are some negative externalities with regards to particulate pollution. And this often raises the question or the concern about people living in these areas located by known emitters. And in addition to that, there are more secondary sources of particulate formation that I won't go through right now. But overall, the research is quite extensive when it comes to particulate matter 2.5. However, there has been newer criticisms that have emerged over the limitations of how we are measuring and modeling the particulate concentrations in an area. And this is something we'll go over here in a little bit. But I first really want to focus on this article because I think it does provide a nice background for why this is important. And this is a two-part article that was published in CHEST. And I find it to be probably the most robust and accessible article on air pollution in general with regards to impact on human health. And I just want to note too that in this article, our own pulmonologist here at Mayo Clinic, Dr. Clayton Cowell, was one of the contributors. So it's nice to see that local doctors and physicians are taking this serious. But the first article was really kind of takes a broad look at air pollution. And one of the things they mentioned is how air pollution may be the greatest environmental risk to health in the world. And it is estimated that approximately 4.2 million deaths occur worldwide annually from exposure to air pollution. And the risks associated are both intrinsic and extrinsic. So, you know, we're thinking about people who already have preconditions such as like asthma and COPD, you know, those common ones that come to mind. But there are also more extrinsic risk factors such as housing, the location of where you live, as well as personal behaviors that may impact your exposure to air pollution. And the second article takes a little deeper dive into the pathophysiology of air pollution with regards to its impact on our bodily systems. And you know, the main one we hear a lot is going to be from the respiratory system. And this is, again, thinking of asthma, COPD, pulmonary fibrosis, cystic fibrosis. You know, anything that can get into the lungs with these types of conditions, it's going to cause damage and put these people in a bad place. But we also have the cardiovascular system, so people with congestive heart failure may be at increased risk. You know, this makes sense given that it's so tied to the respiratory system too. From a neurological standpoint, there's research that is showing that exposure is associated with an increased risk of stroke. And then finally, cancer. You know, over time, exposure to these different pollutants is shown to be associated with lung cancer. And it's also important to note too that a particle, if it gets below a certain point, there's evidence that suggests that it may be able to pass through the lungs into the bloodstream and have more of a downstream impact on different systems too. So it's a very complex thing to control for here. And it's really, you know, as difficult as that situation is, you know, it's also exacerbated by climate change, and specifically, you know, extreme weather events. And the federal, the FEMA released a report a few years back that suggests that climate change is going to increase the likelihood of extreme weather events. And this is thinking like forest fires, extreme flooding, as well as heat and drought. These are all expected to increase, and they all have a direct impact on air pollution. For example, forest fires. I mean, probably the most obvious, you know, if we have a fire in Canada, you know, it releases massive amounts of particulates in the air. These particulates can get swept up into wind currents and taken thousands of miles away and impact people in Minnesota. So it's not just people in these, you know, localized areas that are at risk. And then with floods, you know, when we have extreme flooding and home damage due to water, we're going to have an increased risk of mold and the inhalation of these particles is extremely harmful for our respiratory health, among other things. And then finally, extreme heat and drought. So as the temperature warms, there's an increased risk of desertification, which can just lead to more dust particles floating through the air, more people breathing them in, and can also lead to more infectious disease spread, especially with if nutritious food becomes scarce and people are unable to get the proper nutrition. So I think the big thing about this slide is really to think that even in communities where air quality is relatively good, as climate change continues, these areas that we thought safe might have be at risk of worse air pollution and worse health outcomes as a result. So what can we do about this? This is an article from 2012 from the American Thoracic Society. This was a workshop that was done. And after the workshop, a number of the members proposed a framework for how to study the effects of climate change and adapt and to mitigate and adapt communities to its negative consequences. And there are three areas that were recommended. And the first one was putting more resources into research and investigation, climate change, and not necessarily just air pollution and its impact on respiratory health, but how does climate change impact air pollution, and then so forth, eventually impacting our respiratory health. And then also, it's also important for communities to start developing mitigation and adaptation strategies to build resilient communities as we continue on in this little battle against changing climate. And then finally, and I think this is probably the most important and the one that really hit home with our project over the last 4 years, prioritizing infrastructural needs. And that's just really coming up with the infrastructure to make sure we are collecting data, make sure we have the monitors in place and the system in place to understand how climate change will impact air and then impact our health. And that's kind of what this slide is going into a little bit. Is, they do recommend an increased number of pollen and air quality networks throughout communities, throughout cities, and the country. And then being able to study the epidemiology of air pollution. So how is it impacting us, and what populations are most vulnerable, and how do we figure out how it's impacting them? And then also just embracing and how do we utilize wearable technologies to give us that important data that we otherwise didn't have in the past, and use alert notifications in a way that can help decrease the risk that certain people have when we know of these extreme weather events coming. And then when we have all this data, how do we get it to the right people so that we can intervene when we need to and keep people out of the hospital? And so it's a big paper, lots of ideas, and I think we really started to nail down some of these areas in particular as we went through this research project. And I think it really fits with this idea of a healthy, smart, and connected community. And if we look at the DMC guidelines, we talk about, in the guidelines, it talks about creating a sustainable infrastructure. So how do we limit the impact we have on the environment, and do it in a way that we're not creating more pollution, and we know what kind of what the air is like on a continuous basis. And this is all important for developing those healthy communities where people can, thrive and grow and prioritize their health. And ultimately, it comes down to just being responsible development and creating a city that is really working for everyone. So with that, I did want to turn now to the historical data that we have here in Rochester. And this kind of provides a nice blueprint of what we're doing. And I first want to mention this research article, and this was an article that was published a number of years back by Dr. Gent, and she is a researcher at the University of Yale's Medical School in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health. And we were very lucky to have some consultation with them, given their connection with one of our stakeholders, Mayo Clinic's Precision Population Science Lab, and Dr. Wee, and really a leader in exploring or studying air pollution out east, and it was good to have that resource. But they did this study, and what they looked at were 5 different EPA monitors over the course of a few years. And what they found after looking at this data for PM2.5, that is, was that motor vehicles were the primary contributors for particulate pollution in these given areas. And that is, again, very consistent with what the literature has historically shown. And then they also showed that PM2.5 levels are higher during the colder months than in the warmer months. Again, this is something that has also been very consistent in the literature. And then finally, the PM2.5 variation. So they have 5 different sites that they pulled from here, and each site had a pretty drastic difference in average PM2.5 levels. And specifically here in New Haven and Bridgeport on the bottom there, so there's about a 20-mile difference between those 2 monitors. And if you look at the data, the average is about a change in about 5. So that 5 points is enough to really have a significant impact on certain populations. So what they recommended at the end of the study was that in order to really perform top-notch health analysis with regards to air pollution and health, it's best to be able to pull air data from multiple regional monitors rather than one centralized monitor. And I think that's kind of leads into this next slide here. This is the Rochester Air Quality Center. It's this little red dot here, and it's located at Ben Franklin Elementary School. Now, this monitor records PM2.5 and ozone data continuously throughout the year. And this data then is used to determine whether Rochester and Olmsted County meet national ambient air quality standards. Now, this is a one centralized monitor, and it may raise the question as to whether, does this little dot here account for all the complexities of air pollution for Rochester, let alone Olmsted County. So that's really something we wanted to explore in our when we first started this project. Now we can take a little deeper look here. So national ambient air quality standards set by the EPA are at 12 micrograms per cubic meter, and this is on an annual basis. On a 24-hour basis, that's 35 micrograms per cubic meter. Now, this data here is pulled from the Ben Franklin monitor, and it's showing the yearly averages of PM2.5. So a few things to notice here is, first, we are well below that annual PM2.5 level. Just in 2007, just above 10, with a nice slow decline into 2010, a little spike, and then again, a decrease in PM2.5 concentrations. And then in 2017, just a little bit. Now, this is great and good news for Rochester. There is some research out there, though. One study in particular from Harvard does suggest that even exposure to air pollution or fine particulates within the EPA standard is still associated with an increased risk of more mortality. And this is specifically looking at elderly patients. So there has been efforts to try to decrease the acceptable levels, but that's still in progress. But it's just something to consider going forward. Even though it is good for most people, if we're wanting to develop or create this community, a healthy community, we really need to take into account everyone who may be at risk. And then one more slide, kind of looking at the daily averages of PM2.5 at Ben Franklin. So this is data from 2019. And what we can see here is that about 48 days out of the year, the average PM2.5 level for a day was above that 12, that annual recommendation set by the EPA. We can also see that the levels were typically highest during the colder months, which again is still consistent with the literature we've been seeing in a number of different studies. And more importantly, though, we know that respiratory exacerbations are typically more prevalent in the colder months than those warmer months. So it just really begs the question is how can we start to decrease the particulate pollution during these colder months? Is it as something as easy as, using less energy to heat our homes? Or is it something more complex with regards to, the atmosphere and convection? So, we can, during the colder months, the pollution gets kind of pushed to the ground level and it's more of an exposure risk. And if that's the case, we have to come up with ways to adapt and mitigate this exposure. But the big question remains, is this a fair representation of air quality through our community, or are we just looking at a potential sampling bias? And that's where the Rochester Air Champions really came in. And when we first started this project back in 2017, it was a small group of us, and we really wanted to utilize the citizen science model. And this is just a little kind of definition of citizen science, but involvement of the public in scientific research, whether community-driven or global investigation. I think it's a better way to really think about this is through its strengths. Now, one thing that we were able to do is really pull from the experiences and perspectives of people who were not traditionally in that scientific area. And this is a good thing because we can kind of open our view a little bit and get some new perspectives and some new ideas that we otherwise may miss if we're just kind of working in our little silo. And it's also a great way for people to develop their talents and skills through small pilot projects that can be impactful and can help people really discover kind of what they want to do, what they may be really finding their niche. And that I think that's really important on an individual level. But it also then really gives people the chance to participate in the scientific process and be a part of that knowledge generating process that traditionally has been just kind of kept to the traditional scientists. So it's a very liberating model with that regard. We really wanted to focus our efforts on utilizing that as best we could. So the first study we've called the Air Quality Feasibility Study. And it was a multidisciplinary stakeholder group. And I think it's important to go through a few of these stakeholders just to get an idea of how robust the group was. But we had Mayo Clinic's Precision Population Science Lab, who has just been amazing, even throughout these 4 years of helping guide us in a positive direction and, not sending us, making sure we're not sent out and doing something that can't be useful. So it's really nice to have that scientific backbone from a well-established group. And then at the University of Minnesota Rochester, the Sierra Club and the Sierra Student Coalition, they were just wonderful in being able to spread their wings and kind of bring people into the project who had an interest in the environment, had an interest in health, but weren't kind of in that lane to get involved in this kind of stuff. So just their ability to create new connections for us was amazing. And then the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, they initially borrowed these monitors that we used for the project. And then Olmsted County Public Health was just incredible in helping us kind of share our project with the community after we finished the feasibility study. And they've just been great ever since. And then Zumbro Valley Medical Society, who's just been the strong backbone for pointing us in the right direction and keeping us grounded throughout the project. And the aim of the project now was to, again, assess that geospatial variation of PM2.5, looking at the Ben Franklin effect Is that giving us a fair representation? And then again, we wanted to test that citizen science model. Can we gather enough people in a short amount of time to do a quick kind of breakout project like this? And then how can we do this to raise awareness about air quality in our community and build momentum to go forward? So this is just a little picture on the right here of the monitor we use. I mean, it is about the size of your fist and really a couple clicks to get it up and running. And what it is able to do is measure fine particulate matter in real time and send that data over to an Android device. And then we're able to pull a data file in real time, or rather quickly, and assess that for what the particulate matter levels were. So what we did is we got 8 of these monitors, and we recruited community members, students, whoever wanted to be involved. And we collected in pairs at each location. We identified 8 diverse locations throughout the city, and we collected data from 7:30 in the morning to 8 in the morning, and then 12 in the afternoon to 12:30. The reason we chose these times were that we wanted to try to account for that traffic volume during the commuting hour and the more slow time during that afternoon lunch hour. And we did 2 data collections in August of 2017 and December of 2017. And I'll just share some of the results we have from of that preliminary data. So the first 8 here, the first 8 collections are from the August, and the last 3 are from the December. And what we see from the first one is, again, the PM2.5 levels are within the EPA standard. We do see at most every one of the data collection sites that PM2.5 was higher during that morning commute hour than in the afternoon. So it may suggest that traffic volume is a contributor to that. And then another thing we want to note here, and I think this is probably the most important, is this is the Ben Franklin site right here. And what we see is that the Ben Franklin monitor did have, I think, probably the lowest values of all sites that we collected at during that time period. So it was, again, a good project to really kind of validate some of the literature that we've been seeing and kind of look at the air quality at that Ben Franklin monitor. And we followed that up in December with a quick study too. And again, these were all done downtown. And what we see is that there's a pretty significant jump in the overall PM2.5 levels recorded during that session. It still held true that the PM2.5 levels were higher in the morning commute hour than in the afternoon. But I think, again, this is just a good indication of what we were able to do with some relatively affordable and available technology. And it kind of gave us a momentum going forward. And after the success of the feasibility study, we were awarded an Environmental Achievement Award from Olmsted County and Rochester Public Utility. And this was great. And it really, I think, like I said, gave us momentum to start sharing our work with the community and creating new finding new collaborators to engage with. And one of the big, we developed 2 very significant relationships after this. The first one was with our new relationship with Destination Medical Center, and specifically Kevin. We wanted to try to identify 10 or so different locations throughout the city to place permanent air quality monitors throughout the year. So Kevin was able to help us secure some funding to provide buy purple air monitors. And these monitors are able to measure particulate matter pollutants, not just PM2.5, but also PM1 and PM10. And these are now up and running at 10 different locations throughout the city. And as you can see, we're kind of getting a wide geographical variation here to try to assess the change. And I did pull this about a month ago. And as you can see, I mean, some of these locations here, we're seeing a change of 6 particulate points. So it definitely is showing that there is significant variation throughout the city. But this is really important for a number of reasons. one, it's available to the public. So anyone can log on to this website and take a look in real time of the air that's in their location. And they can just share it with others. The other thing it does is it allows us to pull large data sets of particulate pollution throughout the year. And this is going to be really important going forward as we start to look at some of the key drivers in particulate pollution, maybe with regards to traffic or meteorological variables. Having as much data as we can to perform this statistical analysis or machine learning is going to be incredible. And then I also want to say too that we also purchased these Vesala monitors, and these are a little more sophisticated monitor. They're able to measure particulate pollution as well as gases. So these 4 monitors are going to be placed in the DMC district. So we're going to get a better idea of not just particulate pollution, but gas pollution downtown, and to figure out ways if we need to kind of mitigate some of these exposure risks. So this was a big step, and I think this was a major breakthrough with regards to developing that infrastructure to better understand air pollution. And then the other collaboration that we started during this time was our collaboration with Bike Rochester. And we called this study, our follow-up to our feasibility, the Cycling for Better Air Quality Project. And again, it was a multidisciplinary group. Again, many of the same feasibility partners, but now with Destination Medical Center and Bike Rochester. And one of the aims of the project, now were to kind of improve the granularity of our PM2.5 analysis. So instead of just having 8 people stand in that, one point at a given time, we're now able to take these sensors and collect data in movement. So now we're able to see how does pollution change, not just at a spot, but throughout a block and throughout a mile, which was a nice upgrade. And then we wanted to continue to assess that seasonal variation of PM2.5, as that's what we've kind of been seeing so far in our preliminary research. And then also, we wanted to understand how does PM2.5 vary across Rochester with regards to the census tracts that have been established by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And that is, I think, where we really were able to lean into this environmental justice component. And we really want to limit the disproportionate impact that air pollution can have on certain communities. And so the MPCA has identified census tracts of concern. And the criteria for these are individuals in these areas, at least 40% have an income that is less than 185% the poverty level. In addition, greater than 50% are people of color. So Olmsted County currently has 33 census tracts, and 8 of these tracts are tracts of concern. And in our CBAC study, we were able to cover 6 of these tracts throughout our data collections. And these are all located, these areas of concern are located in these blue shaded areas here. So how do we do this? So we upgraded our sensors to the AirBeam 2 monitor, which really allowed us to move throughout the community. We were able to get 4 with the help of the Precision Population Science Lab and DMC. And Dr. Wee and I first kind of came up with 4 ideal routes in each quadrant of the city. And we wanted to make these routes that accounted for known emitters in the community, like industries, areas of high and low traffic volume, as well as neighborhoods, residential areas, and places where we're going to see schools. And what we did after we created these ideal routes is we sent them over to our cyclists in Bike Rochester, and they were able to look through them and make some amendments. And they came back and said, well, these ideal routes are not very safe at all. So they're able to give us some good recommendations to do this safely, which I think is I joke when I say that, but I think that's an important part of the citizen science component. Is Dr. Wee and myself, we're not cyclists in Rochester, and we don't know the environment, and we don't know what is safe and what isn't. So just being able to get that experience and that perspective from people who are involved in that community really is something that speaks volumes to the citizen science model. What we were able to do then is once a month, these 4 riders would hook up these air beams to their bike or their back, and they would travel each of these routes at the same time. One person would take a route, and they would complete this route from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. And we wanted to keep that time frame within an hour just because of the change in particulate pollution over time with wind and wind speed and everything. So we wanted to try to get the best representation. And as I had on the last slide, these are also just little examples of the bike routes that we had. So we have the north route, south, and then the west and the east route. And then this blue little, this green little marker here is where they began and where they finished here. So we just finished this project last month, and so we're still going through the data, but some preliminary results show that the average for most of these sites throughout the year from 2020 to 2021 was between 8 and 10. And the highest levels came from the south route. There was a month where the minimums were 0 for each of the routes. And I think that was, as I was looking at the data, sometime in October. And then the maximum at times was sometimes into the 40s and above into the 30s, which can be very concerning for acute exposure, especially for people who have a known comorbidity that may put them at risk. But of all, looking at each of these routes and looking at the data, 45% of the time in that south route, the particulate matter concentrations were greater than that annual EPA standard. And that's something, I think it's important to note that, we have the ability to look at this stuff in real time and figure this out. So it's very interesting to see that. And then this is more just a graph that is showing the average PM2.5 concentrations at each route throughout the entirety of the project. And as you can see here, we have the purple route, which is, or the south route, which had some of the highest levels throughout the collection. We can still see that we have the higher levels occurring towards those colder months, with an overall decrease during those warmer months, and then another blip up during the colder month again. So we were able to track this really well. The interesting thing here, though, this red line right here is the Ben Franklin monitor. And this is the average PM2.5 during that same hour that our Bike Rochester data collectors were out collecting. And what we see is a pretty significant difference between the other routes that we're on and the data points we're collecting throughout those routes and that one spot at Ben Franklin. So I think this is a really important slide, and I think it really goes into the idea of, again, is that Ben Franklin monitor that fair representation of air quality?
Hi, Matt. We have one question from the chat.
Yeah.
Do the high pollution points that you are seeing as part of these bike rides or other data that you are collecting correlate with low-income housing or neighborhoods?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. So I do have a slide on that in a little bit. We haven't been able to, because that we just finished up the study, we haven't been able to look at that quite yet and analyze it. But I'm hoping that we'll be able to present this data at EarthFest coming up here. And I think at that time, I'd really like to have that data to kind of share with the community. So yeah, that's a great question, and definitely part of our next step for analyzing this data. So this is, I just wanted to pull the February route for that Bike Rochester, or that CBAC study. And this is February 2020 and February 2021. And you have little dots on here, and these dots indicate the PM2.5 concentration in that specific moment. And the green dots represent the PM2.5 level of from 0 to 12, a good range or within that EPA standard. And then the yellow dots are indicate ranges from 13 to 24. And this is more of a moderate level. And then the red dots are going to indicate PM2.5 concentrations of 25 or greater. And these are really going to be the areas where people with any known conditions who are being exposed to this over a period of time could definitely start to experience some sort of health risks. But it's interesting to see some of these areas throughout the route, and specifically on this 2021 route here, all these red dots throughout this community, and then kind of wrapping around. And if you look at most of the route, the PM2.5 concentrations were mostly in that moderate range. So it's quite dispersed throughout the community. And just for a point of reference, this little star right here on the map, that's kind of roughly the spot of the Ben Franklin sensor. So just trying to give an idea of the variation across space and time. So next step. So as you asked, Kevin, we want to assess the potential air quality disparities by census tracts. That's going to be an important thing to consider as we go forward. And we want to know then this is our mobile data. We're kind of creating a mobile infrastructure here now too. But we want to look at our stationary network to see if that data kind of overlaps with our mobile data. And we want to do good science here. So we want to make sure that all the data we have is good and that the integrity is high. And then we also want to use this data. And I think this is looking at that last map where we see all those red dots. With this mobile network, we can use this data to find spots in the city where we think we need to place a more permanent monitor to gather more data over the course of time to see, is this just a blip or is this something that's consistent, and is this impacting the health of this community in this area? And that's kind of the end goal of a lot of this research, is eliminating those disparities. So those are that's just kind of a look at some of the citizen science projects we've done for data collection. For the project going forward, there's a lot we can do with this. And I like to think of it in kind of a three-pronged approach here. So we have the community aspect. And I think of this as, getting more people involved in the citizen science projects, in the data collection, the creation of the projects and the implementation, because this data is going to be incredibly useful as we go forward in understanding how air pollution impacts our health. And not just that, we need to, when people participate in this kind of stuff, it really creates an excitement, and it's able to tap into people's passions about the environment and do it in a positive way. And with that, we can start having these people disseminate this information and this new knowledge we're creating throughout the community. So creating a nice healthy culture in that way. And then from the scientist and the clinician standpoint, so all this data is going to be extremely important for them when we have the resources like using AI and machine learning to assess what are the main drivers of these spikes in particulate pollution. And then being able to look at the electronic medical record of these individuals who are having asthma exacerbations, COPD exacerbations, or heart failure exacerbations. Is air pollution something we haven't been looking at in the past? And is it a driver for some of these poor health outcomes? And then being able to kind of lean into these new technologies with telehealth to inform people in real time and intervene in real time to prevent these poor health outcomes from happening. And then finally, from a tech innovator perspective, so we're coming up with all this knowledge and all these ways of approaching health, but how do we implement in a way where everyone can benefit from what we're learning? And there's been a lot of push to create these gamification type tools that people within the community can use. And they can link up their personal data with, environmental data, and we can track, in real time the risks and the exposures they have on a daily basis, and making pathways for this data to be securely transferred to clinicians to prevent those poor health outcomes is going to be incredibly important. So going forward, in order to do all this, we're going to need more data sensors. Whether they're the purple air monitors, the Valsalva monitors, or the air beams. Rochester, we focused on Rochester over the last 4 years, but again, that one monitor is not just a representation of Rochester, but also Olmsted County. How can we start to, expand this network into the periphery area of the county where people are also going to be exposed to particulate pollution on a daily basis, just maybe from a different source? And this is going to require new tablets and phones that we use to help facilitate the flow of data. And then research support. As I mentioned earlier, we want to do good science, and we need to create the systems that are going to make sure the integrity of our data is top notch. So validating monitors, making sure they're not going drifting, going out of calibration. That's going to take time and effort and support. And then finally, just tech support. So all this data is going to have to flow to some place, and being able to set up the infrastructure to do that and do it in a safe and secure way is top priority. And then just with the gamification and the back-end programming, that's also going to require some additional resources. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here. Just want to specifically thank everyone that I've been able to work with the last 4 years. And, thinking back to 2017, with that first table with Mayor Norton, Dr. Patel, and Dr. Wee and Rick, and, just all the other people. I mean, it was amazing to be a part of that, and to have watched this grown with all your support is amazing. So I just want to say thank you and be happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, with that, does anyone have any questions or things they'd like to share with the group?
Kevin, this is Asha. Can I make a couple of comments?
Sure. Yep.
So first of all, it's been an honor to see how a small spark can create a wildfire of sorts in a good way. And Matt, you've really led the way and lit the way to transformation. I just had 3 things to re-emphasize. One is with the vulnerability to misinformation through social media, it really is our story to share together of how do we maintain truth, and how do we protect the integrity of the scientific enterprise. So that's just one thought for all of us to reflect on. Who do we believe, and how will we trust going forward information that's coming from this group or any other citizen science group? The second is in terms of partnerships, just to bring back a few international groups, because Sigma Xi is the international science group that promotes transdisciplinary learning and citizen science. So we certainly can bridge the Mayo chapter with Sigma Xi International. And Rotary has identified as a 7th global focus area the environment, and there's funding there if somebody has energy and time and skills to put together a Rotary grant. And finally, we do have lines to UNESCO and the UN Environmental Program. And Mayor Norton, I'd love to have your wizardry on how do we connect the dots between a city project, a state level policy solution, and some of the offers, the opportunities to work at the level of the UN. And then finally, just like when we're breathing and we get short of breath, we can take different parts and figure out why that one part isn't making the person work well. But it really is the integrated goals and the integrated community response that we're trying to so nicely put together. And clean air quality with clean water, with good food will move us in a much more integrated way to a whole healthy community. But a great presentation, and I really look forward to again, your leadership, Matt and Kevin. How do we create these partnerships that sustain and succeed our graduates as they go forward?
Yes, Matt, this is Ken Potts. Thank you. That was excellent. I just wanted to share a historical anecdote that gets at how air pollution impacts has impacts beyond individual health to community health and urban development. You referenced several of these things, and I think that's where you're going with your research. I sent this paper citation to Kevin, so I think he'll distribute it, but it comes out of a study done in the United Kingdom where they looked at industrial revolution cities and why was the east side of town always the poor side of town. And they drew a direct correlation just based on two things, factory locations and prevailing winds. And so not only were people who lived east of the factories impacted, but that had a lasting impact on property values, future development, all sorts of things, which I think you're starting to tread into. And so to try and tie that toward a possible solution for what you're looking at in Rochester, it's certainly hard to shut down or move a factory, but if you've targeted traffic patterns as being the pollution source, that's something that we can deal with, doing some traffic mitigation solutions. So very much looking forward to the next steps. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ken. Thanks, Dr. Patel. Any other questions or comments from the group?
Kevin, I have one more curiosity for Matt. Matt, what do you do with your day job?
Yeah, so I'm a respiratory therapist at Mayo Clinic. So I work in the inpatient pulmonary lab. I'm doing a lot of pulmonary function tests on the inpatient side. So a lot of people with pulmonary disease and cardiac disease. So yeah, that's my 7 to 3.
Nice. I usually don't hear it referenced as 7 to 3, so that was new for me.
They're pretty great healthcare hours, I will say.
Yeah. Awesome. Any other questions or comments for Matt or others? Great. Yeah, well, I also just wanted to extend thanks, Matt. This is really awesome. We're excited to see the results that seem like the news will drop in April for some of these EarthFest activities for the latest round of data, which I think we're all excited for, and I'm excited to see the next steps too. So thanks for your leadership and thanks for this presentation today.
Well, thanks for having me, Kevin.